Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to do my best to eradicate all living plant life in my yard. So with that, let's get into it. Now, if you're just joining us on this project, I already have a massive pile of brush from a bunch of the shrubs that I cut down, but we have a number of those to go, a bunch of stumps to take care of, and this roughly 30-foot tree that's still taking over in the corner. Now, I've done a separate video that I will link in the description below that describes how to properly cut down a tree, or as best as I could probably explain it. But in the meantime, I wanted to get a bunch of these little shrubs and roots cleaned up so that way I could actually get at the roots and then eventually pull them out. So today's goal was pretty much kill off as much as we possibly could, remove everything we can, and then worry about cleaning it up later. Now, fortunately for me, I did have access to a chainsaw that I had borrowed for this. Unfortunately, though, this chainsaw was not exactly running the best it's ever run. Now, the last episode ended when the blade spontaneously decided to jump off of the chainsaw, and even though I spent the time to reinstall it and adjust a bunch of things overnight, you could see I was still having a number of other issues with the blade binding today. But after some additional tinkering, it was back to running, and I started clearing out the brush below this tree, knowing that that was going to be my next big target. And I know somebody at some point's gonna chime in and say, "Oh, that's not a big tree, and I cut things down like that with a pair of scissors." But keep in mind, this is not something I routinely do, and the camera kind of warps your perspective. This thing is still about 30 feet tall, and the trunk is roughly 5 inches wide. So to me, that's big enough to be a cause for concern, considering how much damageable stuff is immediately next to it. Not the least of which is the retaining wall that it is literally growing into.
Alright, we got a cleared out area so that we can get to the base of the tree. But as you can see here, when I say it's growing into the retaining wall, I mean that's literally formed around the blocks. All these blocks are pressed in and crushed back. This is going to take out not only this retaining wall, but this one here and that one down there in the neighbor's yard as well.
So that's really why I'm getting rid of this, right? I want to prevent further damage to more retaining walls because I'm tired of dumping money into stupid things that don't really improve my property value. Beyond that, I am trying to be a good neighbor because the neighbor that lives behind me on the other side of this white fence approached me and said, "Hey, I'm worried about that tree. It's going to take out the fence and the retaining wall, and it is going to be very expensive for both of us if that happens," which I didn't want to pay for. Let's be real. I don't want to pay for a tree destroying stuff that I didn't get the pleasure of destroying myself. Now, to be honest, I was somewhat nervous because even though this tree doesn't look massive, it's still pretty heavy, and the fact is that it's leaning pretty much the only place that I can stand when I'm trying to cut it. So the risk of this, especially when I'm holding a running chainsaw, is a lot higher than it might look. Now, I did a separate video that I'll link in the description below that goes into the details of how to cut down a tree, but for this section, just know that it is relatively dangerous, and that, per usual, I only sort of know what I'm doing. And you'll especially notice this on tree number 2, where I am just ratcheting this thing to hope that it goes into the direction I want it to go, and then when I finally cut through it, it pretty much jumps directly at me, which, I'm not gonna lie, that scared me a lot. Because I thought for certain it was coming for me, and then it fell on the fence, and I thought for certain it was coming for my wallet. Now, fortunately, I got the angle pretty good, so it rolled off gently and there was no damage whatsoever, but there was definitely a moment where I thought I am never going to recover from this financially. So fortunately, that was crisis averted, but while cleaning up these smaller limbs, I did notice something else that I probably should have done a better job avoiding.
Did a pretty good job, but what I didn't see, and what blends in very well even here, that you might be able to depict, is that this here is a metal pipe. And that's actually the property line, but when I went to cut down a certain section of the tree, I caught the metal pipe.
All right, let's be real. You probably couldn't see the pipe in there either until I pointed it out. So yeah, I probably ruined that chainsaw blade. And Dad, if you're watching, I'm sorry. But that's a problem for later. Let's move on to the top half of the yard and keep cutting. Now, if you haven't watched any of the prior episodes and you're wondering why I'm killing these perfectly fine bushes, 2 reasons. The first is that I don't want to have recurring yard maintenance that's always sucking up my time. And the second is I'm trying to level out the yard. And this is pretty much where the new retaining wall is going to be. And I don't want any of these growing through the new retaining wall. But that said, as I was cutting these down, I did have more chainsaw issues. This bad boy just kept on sputtering and dying, and it was not because of me dulling the blade by hitting a metal pipe, it was because it was roughly out of oil and I forgot to check that at the start of the day. So after a good old-fashioned lube job, this girl was back in action and we were ready to continue cutting down the rest of these shrubs that I have no desire to ever have to trim again. And as you can see, it was actually going relatively smoothly. I mean, I was obviously creating a whole lot of mess that I would have to deal with shortly after, but for now, I was ignoring that in the hopes that it would just go away. And we all know the debris isn't going to magically disappear, but did I feel better about killing all of these things? Absolutely. So with that, let's go over some of my kill count.
That's dead. That's dead. That's hopefully dead. That's dead. That's dead. And we got a few more piles of brushes that we got to clear up. Now, the only one I have left is that one there in the corner that's like really close to the house. Didn't quite have the confidence to get in there with the metal fence behind it and the house corner right next to it when I was first starting. But now that I've taken down a few more things, we're gonna go for it. Let's get killing.
Now, having tackled every other plant in my yard, I now had the confidence to chop down this one shrub with the knowledge to not touch my house or the wire fence behind it using the chainsaw. I don't know why it took me so long to figure that out, but hey, we got there eventually, right? But on a more serious note, look at how much different this shot looks from the start to the end. You can actually see the sunlight coming through now, and I'm not kidding when I say this was a tangible difference to how it made this yard feel. Before, when all these shrubs were blocking everything, yeah, sure, I had a little bit of privacy, but at the expense of having it feel very claustrophobic and not having an open air feel because I was literally blocking out all of the sunlight. And while it's great to have the sunlight shining through, we do now have the issue of clearing out this brush. For reference, I'm about 6'2" before these boots are on, so 6'3" or 6'4" in this shot. This pile here is probably about 10 to 15 feet diameter, and looking around the yard, I have the same issue in all of these other locations because, quite frankly, this is a lot more vegetation than I initially thought it would be. Which means at this point I could finally change out of these scorching hot jeans and boots to put on the renowned project clothes of my worst gym shorts and the prettiest shoes I have ever owned. There was nothing glorious about this part, it was just a matter of chopping up all of the branches and then bundling them up with some kitchen twine. I was doing all this by hand because, quite frankly, I wasn't just going to blindly press a chainsaw into a pile of sticks. That would have been a little bit extreme and unproductive. But even after bringing down the pile about 5 feet, it was still roughly waist height, but I had so many bundles of sticks, and I am so tempted to use the other word, but I can't because I'll get banned from the internet. I did have to stop for the day though, because it was about to sprinkle on these fags, and when I resumed the next morning, I did notice that the leaves were a little bit more dried out, which made everything just a little bit easier to cut down and to bundle together, so that was a good thing. But quite frankly, me bundling sticks is not very exciting to watch, so let's just jump throughout the day to check on my progress. Alright, so here is all the debris I cleared, and as you can see, this pile is up to my waist. It's about 3 feet off the ground. Again, I'm 6'2", and this pile is roughly 25 feet long, so just do some math on how many sticks I bundled. With a good portion of the smaller stuff taken care of, I could now chop up the larger trees, and then I could start bundling up what turned out to be a very aggressive thorn bush in the corner of my yard. And let me just say that this bush turned out to be one of the biggest nightmares of this project, because trying to bundle all these thorns and then, as you'll see in a future episode, removing this stump proved a lot more challenging than I could have ever anticipated. So with that, we will resume in the next episode when I lose both my sanity and a fight to a thorn bush. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.